So today we're finishing this six-part series that we've been in called Right in the What? Right in the Eye. And if you missed any of the first 5 parts or all of them, you can always go to our website, okay, Brookview, www.brookviewchurch.com, and you can get caught up. All of the first 5 messages are there, along with others going way back. So if you were here for week 1 of this series, you might remember the crazy story that launched this series. It was nuts. In fact, if you were going to go back, if you hadn't been here for any of this series and you decided, I want to go back and catch one of the other ones, you should do the first one because it was so interesting. It's one of the most fascinating and disturbing stories in all of ancient literature. And it's like a blend between Halloween 4 and Deliverance. And it's found in the book of Judges. An idea flowed out of that story that kind of launched us into this series. Because there's something in us that just sort of wants to do what we want, when we want, with whom we want, and then we add the American caveat, as long as nobody gets what? Hurt. I want to do what I want, when I want, with whom I want, as long as nobody gets hurt. And so we've talked about that idea, what that idea looks like lived out throughout this series. Because there was a period in the history of ancient Israel where that's just exactly what everybody did. In fact, as we've seen at the end of the Old Testament book of Judges, the summary statement for that entire 300-plus year period of time in history, the very final, the final sentence, the final words of the book are this. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Everyone just did what was right in his own eyes. And there's a little bit of that in me. And there's a little bit of that in you. And so we have been talking all about that. And the tragedy for the nation of Israel can be the same tragedy for you and me. God had established this nation to do something extraordinary, but instead of looking up, instead of seeking God and looking up and listening to Him, the nation started looking around. They decided they wanted to be just like everybody else. They wanted to be a nation just like all the other nations. They wanted to worship like other nations. They wanted to handle money. They wanted to treat the poor just like all the other nations. And so time after time after time, they would disobey God, and they would get into this cycle. They would disobey God, and then they would face the consequences of their decisions, some kind of disaster, and then they would cry out to God for deliverance, and God would rescue them. And they would say, oh, thank you, God. We have learned our lesson, right? We are never going to do that again. But before too long, they'd forget and they'd start looking around again, start ignoring God, and start living like all the neighboring nations. And pretty soon they were in this cycle all over again and again and again. But this is really pretty incredible. God never gives up on them. That's the staggering thing in the book. He never gives up on them. He allows them to experience the natural consequences of their bad decisions. He doesn't shield them from the pain of their choices. But when they turn back to Him and they ask for help, He forgives them and He restores them again and again and again and again and again. Now, Judges was like a really dark time, unthinkable evil and violence and injustice. Like darkness on a level that we can barely fathom. And again, just to go back to the first message of this series, it was a story of cultural insanity, like the entire culture, like just nationwide madness. And yet, even so, amidst that, there were little seeds of very honorable people. And today, we're going to look at a story of a few of those honorable people. We're going to look at the story of a few people who refused to just look around at everybody else and try to be like everybody else. People who in that society people who in a society that had abandoned honor chose to live personally with like the highest levels of honor. And so the story begins with this woman who is so angry with God. She's so disappointed with God that she declared to her town, as we'll see in the story, that God has abandoned me. God has forsaken me. Like when I look at my circumstances, there's no evidence that anything that I'm looking at, that there is a God. There's no evidence that there is a God who cares for me. Look at my life. And I just want to say it, that might be how some of you are feeling these days, because that happens, right? But as the story develops, we see a man who, even though when he looked around, he saw no evidence of God, even though when he looked around, he saw no evidence of God's activity, no evidence of God's faithfulness, he decided to buck the system, to go against the culture of all that was happening in the surrounding nations and even within Israel. He decided to swim against the stream, to defy his culture. He decided to remain faithful to God because he believed, and he was clinging to this, God is at work even if I can't see exactly how God is at work. And God, in his very unusual way, he brings these unlikely characters together, and in doing so, he paved the way for his greatest work in the world. This is truly an amazing story. Now, this story is found in the Old Testament book of Ruth. And my guess is that many of you are pretty familiar with this story, but what you may not realize, what you may have never realized, is that the story of Ruth takes place during the period of the Judges, this really dark time, this dark part of Israel's history that we've been talking about. So this story happens right in the middle of that, and it is like a bright spot right in the middle of the darkness. Okay, it's like a breath of fresh air when the skies are filled with smoke. So, okay, let me jump right into the story. Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. This is how it begins. In the days when the judges ruled, okay, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. So this story centers in the time of the judges in Bethlehem, and I'm pretty sure most of us have heard of Bethlehem. Okay, there's a lot of history that's gone on there. This is 1,000 years or more before Jesus, okay, a long time before Jesus. So there's a terrible famine in the land, in all of Israel. So this family from Bethlehem in Israel decides to leave their nation to go outside of Israel and try to make a life in Moab. Now, Moab's not part of Israel. It was a neighboring nation. But this man and his wife and their 2 sons leave Bethlehem. It says, the man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were, and to be honest, they're kind of hard to pronounce, and it doesn't matter. You don't need to know that for the story. So, you get the picture. This couple, okay, Elimelech and his wife Naomi, they live in Bethlehem. There's this horrible famine. The economy is terrible. They can't make a living. They can't feed themselves. They can't feed their boys. So they pack up their 2 sons and they move to Moab. And they get there, and after a while, they think, our sons need to get married. Okay? The problem is, we're in Moab. Okay, all the women are Moabites. They worship other gods, and they have all kinds of strange customs. But they're like, what else are we going to do? The boys need ladies. Okay, so they marry their 2 sons off to Moabite women. Time goes by, and Elimelech dies. Okay, so Naomi becomes a widow. So now it's Naomi and her 2 sons and her 2 daughters-in-law. That's it. Time goes by and one son dies. Time goes by and the other son dies. So now Naomi, a Jewish Israelite woman in the foreign nation of Moab, and she's got almost nobody. The only family she has in Moab are these 2 daughters-in-law, the women that married her sons that are now gone. Well, Naomi decides That's it. God is against me. God has cursed me. God isn't going to help me here in this foreign land with all these foreign people. I'm going to need to go back home to my family, to my people. And so she says to the 2 daughters-in-law, she says, look, I'm sorry that I got you into this whole thing, but I'm going back to Bethlehem. I've got to go back to Bethlehem. So you stay here, okay? Get married if you can. Make a life for yourself. Have a nice life. But God has abandoned me, and I got to go. Now, one of the daughters-in-law decides to stay in Moab. The other daughter-in-law, Ruth, decides to go with Naomi. Now, this is a big deal. This is like a really big deal because this was a dangerous decision. And if you've been with us throughout this series, this time period, it was the world was a dangerous place for women. I mean, much of the world still is a very dangerous place for women. But in ancient times, and especially in these ancient times, it was such a dangerous place for women. But Ruth says to Naomi, I'm going with you. Okay, I am going with you. And Naomi says, no. Okay, you can't. Like, this is too dangerous. That's ridiculous. These are my people where I'm going, but they're not your people. Okay, you're going to be a foreigner. And our God says that we're supposed to treat foreigners well, but okay, that's not how it actually works out at all. And I might be able to kind of be around you and buffer some of that for you for a while, but I'm old, okay, and I'm going to die. And then you're just going to be a foreign woman in a foreign land, and this is way, way too dangerous. But Ruth, in one of the most beautiful passages in all of Scripture, says this. It says, but Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Ruth says, Naomi, I'm with you. I am with you. I am with you in this to the end. She says, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. Question. How many of you feel that way about your mother-in-law? If you're sitting next to her, you should raise your hand. But here's something to consider about this story. Like, what kind of person must Naomi have been that Ruth loved her that much and was devoted to her that much? I mean, the respect that Ruth had for Naomi is off the charts. And apparently, Naomi had been extraordinarily kind to Ruth. And so imagine this picture. Ruth, the young Moabite widow, and Naomi, the older Israelite widow, they make this long journey around the Dead Sea up to Bethlehem. And they survive the journey, okay, which was far from a given in that ancient world. 2 women by themselves traveling with no protection. Well, they get into town, and the people start looking at this older woman, and as you read the story, you see they start to whisper. They start to whisper. They're like, is that Naomi? Like, I think that's Naomi. Like, is that Naomi? And who's that with her? Who's with Naomi? And eventually they gather around her and they ask, is it you? Is it really you? Like, where have you been all these years? And where's your husband? And where are your sons? What has happened to you, Naomi? And she says, you know what? Don't call me Naomi. I want you to call me Mara, which means bitter. She says, I'm no longer Naomi. I'm bitter. And they say, well, why are you bitter? And she says, this is Ruth 1:21, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. She's like, there is no God. And if there is a God, he doesn't know my name. There is no God. But if there is a God, he doesn't hear my prayers. Maybe all those stories that we heard as children are just that. They're just stories. And even if they are true, for whatever reason, that God is not interested in me. I'm just a nobody to God. And yet here's something kind of ironic, I think. More than 3,500 years later, people all over the world know her name. She is like one of only a few women from this ancient period whose name and whose story have survived. Because not only had God not abandoned her, but she was actually about to be at the very epicenter of God's activity on earth, and she had no idea. The story continues. When Naomi and Ruth arrived back in Bethlehem, it's Barvest Harley. Gotta lay off the Budweiser before church, you know? Sorry. It's barley harvest season. And now, this is like central to the story. And so let me take a few minutes to explain what happened with barley harvest. Here's how it worked. There would be landowners who had like acres and acres of barley. And when it came time to harvest, they would, of course, send lots of workers or servants into their fields to harvest the barley, okay? But they would not harvest all of it, and that was intentional. There was this law in Israel that had been given by Moses, okay, from God to Moses, to the nation of Israel, that said, you can only harvest your field once. So don't go back and harvest a second time and get whatever you missed. Whatever gets missed the first time stays, and you leave it there. And what happens is then the poor and the widows and the needy can come behind you, and they can have enough to eat, and they can have enough to live, and they can pick up whatever is left over. And in this way, as a nation, you will love and serve those in need. In this way, you will reflect to your own people and to the people in the surrounding nations that God is a God of compassion. So Naomi says to Ruth, look, I need you to go into the fields and glean enough somehow for us to be able to eat or to be able to sell so that we can survive. Now, I would go with you and we would do this together, but I'm too old. So I need you to go and I need you to do this. Join the rest of the poor and the rest of the widows and the rest of the needy and go and glean in the barley fields. So Ruth chooses a random barley field. And we find out that this whole process is very dangerous for widows, very dangerous for women. Because these are defenseless women, alone, scattered out in these fields. It's a male-dominated society. And not only that, she's a foreigner. I mean, not only is she a poor widow, she's not even an Israelite. Now, it just so happens that she chooses a field, the field of a man named Boaz. And it turns out that Boaz is a distant relative of Naomi's deceased husband, Elimelech. Okay, now we don't know that at this point in the story. So Boaz kind of walks out into his fields and he sees this foreign woman out gleaning in his field with all of the Israelite women. And they're picking the leftovers in the fields, and he kind of elbows one of the guys that's with him, a few of the guys, and he's like, who's the new woman? Who is the foreigner there in my field? And they say, oh, that's Ruth. She's the daughter-in-law of Naomi. And by this time, the story had circulated about this really strange Moabite woman because she had chosen to remain faithful to her mother-in-law, even though it meant leaving her home, her city, everything was familiar, her family, her friends, her life, her culture, and making this dangerous trek around the Dead Sea with an Israelite mother-in-law. So rumors spread about her. And we see that Boaz is impressed. In fact, he had a conversation with Ruth later on in the story, and here's what he said. Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law. since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. And then listen to what he says. This is so out of character with everything else going on during this really dark period of the Judges. He says to her, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." I believe that God sees the way that you have lived with honor. I believe that God sees the way that you have honored your mother-in-law. He sees the way that you've traveled here and supported her and served her. And so may God honor you and reward you for all that you are doing. And then he turns to his men, his workers and his servants, and he says, "Whatever you do, do not molest her. Do not bother her. Do not mistreat her. When she is in my field, she is under my protection. You let her glean all that she can. You let her take all that she can. But whatever you do, you do not bother her. You do not sexually assault her. She's an honorable woman who has done an honorable thing. She isn't just some foreigner that's wandered in. She's a highly respectable woman. So you make sure to treat her with great respect." Well, because of that, she's very, very successful with her gleaning. And Naomi's like, "What in the world? Like, how are you bringing home this much barley every day? Like, this is unprecedented. Like, what is happening?" And so Ruth says, "Well, I've found favor with a landowner. He's protecting me and showing me great kindness and favor, and his name is Boaz." And Naomi's like, "What? Boaz? I know Boaz. Like, he's a distant relative of my husband Elimelech. Like, this is awesome." So time goes by, and this is kind of how they live for quite some time, and things are going pretty well. But Naomi's getting older. And so eventually she says, "Look, Ruth, I'm not long for this world. And when I die, you're going to be on your own here. You need protection. You need a defender. You need somebody to watch out for you." So Naomi decides that Ruth needs to find what they call a Kinsman-Redeemer, okay, or a guardian redeemer. And again, now let me explain this, because it's like this is another really big part of the story. A Kinsman-Redeemer, this is the easiest way to think of it. There's not a cultural, match for this. But here's how you can think of it. It's like a super rich, distant uncle in a big family. Like the distant uncle that's just like crazy off the charts rich. And whenever somebody in the family got into a financial jam, the Kinsman-Redeemer could come along and he could bail them out. Now, the Kinsman-Redeemer was not obligated to bail anybody out. But this was an official title that people carried and that people understood. Kinsman-Redeemer or guardian redeemer. And there were a variety of things that a redeemer could do. Okay? The redeemer could protect impoverished family. Okay? They could provide for them and make sure that they had shelter and make sure they had protection during tough times. He could repurchase lost property. Sometimes people would get into a financial bind and they would have to sell family property. Okay, and they would lose the property. The redeemer could go and buy it back for them and make sure that it stayed in the family. And again, this is the ancient world. And so if you owed money and even your property or whatever you had couldn't cover your debt, then you would be taken as a slave. There was no bankruptcy. You would become a slave. Not only you, but your wife, your children. So the wealthy family member could redeem relatives sold as slaves. He could buy them back from slavery, pay the debt, and set them free. And then if a male family member died and his estate and his family name had no male heir or no male relative, he could step in and provide a male heir for relatives. Okay, so Naomi says to Ruth, "Look, we need to find a guardian redeemer, a kinsman redeemer." And Ruth is like, "Well, okay, sorry, mother-in-law, but you're old. And so you're not going to be able to have kids. So here's how this would have to work. They would have to marry me. So why in the world would an Israelite man do that? Have you forgotten? I'm a Moabite. Okay, I'm a foreigner. I'm a nothing. I'm a Moabite poor widow. Now, to complicate all this, and for us, trying to understand the cultures is already complicated, but apparently there's a piece of property connected to all this. So Elimelech, Naomi's deceased husband, had property rights. There's some estate, but in order to keep it in the family, they would need a kinsman-redeemer. Okay, so Naomi finally quits beating around the bush with Ruth, and she just comes out and says, like, Ruth, you need to ask Boaz to be our kinsman-redeemer. Which means, Ruth, you need to ask Boaz to marry you. Now, in our, if you've read this story, and you're familiar with this story, in our, highly sexualized American culture, we read things into this story that just aren't there. As Americans, we read this and we're picturing, this super hot Moabite woman that comes walking into town, right? And all the guys in town, all the Israelite guys are like, dang, who's the new hot chick? And then there's Boaz, right? And Boaz is like this sleazy old rich guy, and he's got his shirt all buttoned down, and his chest hair's hanging out, and there's gold chains everywhere. And he's going through a midlife crisis, right? And he's driving the sports car. The thing is, none of that is in the story. It's not even insinuated in the story. That's us projecting American culture right onto these people. What we see in the story is the exact opposite. Boaz isn't this lustful old man looking at a hot younger woman. He's this guy with unshakable character. And if you read the story, what is it that actually draws him to Ruth? It's not so much her figure. Okay, it's her honor, it's her integrity, it's her character. So Ruth, in this powerful narrative, and if you haven't read it, I encourage you to read it for yourself. In the most appropriate way that fit that culture, in an expression of surrender and humility, she goes to Boaz, knowing that he would probably say no. It's it's one thing to let me glean in your fields, to protect me from your workers. It's another thing to redeem me and make me your wife, and then make my children your heirs and risk having to share your estate with my children. Who does that? Who does that with a foreign woman? So she goes to Boaz and she says, would you be my kinsman redeemer? And Boaz says, yes, absolutely yes. But there's one small hitch. There's a male relative that's closer to Naomi than me, and he gets first dibs. He gets first right of refusal on the estate and on you. So Boaz says, I'm not just going to do this without following the law. Okay? Even though no one else follows the law, I'm an honorable man. I'm not going to do something shady. I'm not going to do some backdoor deal. I'm going to trust the law, and I'm going to trust the process, and I'm going to trust God. And I'm going to go to this other man and make all of this plain and see if we can work this out. So Boaz goes and he meets with this relative, and he says, Naomi, okay, you know Naomi. The guy's like, yeah. Naomi, through Ruth, has asked me to be her kinsman redeemer. There's a piece of property that needs to be purchased, needs to be redeemed, and to make sure it stays in the family. But you are closer, you're a closer relative to Elimelech than I am. Would you be willing to be Naomi's kinsman redeemer and buy that property? And here's what the conversation looked like. It says, then Boaz said, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. So he's like, if you buy the property, which is a pretty sweet deal, you also have to marry the Moabite woman, which is not such a sweet deal. Because when you have children with her, her son will get an inheritance that will come out of your estate, And that's all part of the deal. Are you willing to do that? And it says, at this, the guardian redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. It's like it's too risky. It's too risky. I don't know what comes with marrying that woman. She might be crazy. I don't know. I don't know what her family's like on the other side of the Dead Sea. I mean, they might make a journey up here, and it might make like Thanksgiving and Christmas really awkward. I don't know what people are going to think of me, like marrying a foreigner. So if you want her, you take her yourself. So Boaz, an honorable man who recognizes the honor in Ruth, who honored her mother-in-law, the one that had decided, God has abandoned me. I'm bitter. God has forsaken me. Boaz hears the words of his relative. If you want her, she's yours. And he says, thank you very much. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. Now that could be like the end of the story. Like the one honorable man does the honorable thing. And he takes a risk with this Moabite woman in order to honor his relative. And he makes sure that she has a covering, that she's protected. He takes her as his wife, and that's the end of the story. Except, it turns out that God was up to something much, much bigger. Something that nobody saw coming. So we find out that Ruth and Boaz are married, and they have a son, and his name is Obed. And there's this very tender part at the very end of the book of Ruth, where Naomi is now an old woman. She's at the very end of her life, and she is holding baby Obed one day. And she's looking at this sweet little grandchild. And she says, turns out God was faithful to me after all. I gave up on God. I was so sure God had abandoned me. She looks into the face of this grandbaby and she says, surely God has blessed me. God has sustained me. God has allowed me to live long enough to hold this beautiful baby boy. And I have seen God redeem me and my family. And then Naomi dies. And eventually, Boaz and Ruth would die. But Obed grows up and gets married and has a son. And Obed's son is named Jesse. And Jesse, he grows up and he gets married and he has a whole bunch of sons. And years go by, and one day God speaks in a very famous passage. God speaks to the prophet Samuel, and he says, hey, I'm about to do something new in the nation of Israel. I'm about to do something that will have ramifications for thousands of years in Israel. And to begin it all, I've picked out a man to become king. So I want you to take your horn of oil, I want you to go to his house, and I want you to anoint the man. So here's what it says in 1 Samuel. God is speaking to Samuel. He says, fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to who? To Jesse. Where? In Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. And so Samuel shows up and he says to Jesse, Jesse, I need you to line up all of your sons because God has chosen one of them to be the king. And so for Jesse, that's a pretty good day. I mean, when somebody shows up the door and says, hey, one of your kids is going to be king, it's like, okay, I don't even care who. Just take one. Because now I'm the father of the king, And so many of you know this story. Jesse lines up the sons, okay, and Samuel looks at them and he starts with the oldest, and he looks at the oldest son and he's like, surely this is the king. I mean, this guy, he just looks like it. Surely this is the king. And God says, nope, not him. And so Samuel just kind of goes down the line, and God's like, nope, 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 nope. So Samuel's like, Jesse, you got any more sons? And Jesse's like, well, yeah, there's my youngest. But he's out in the pasture, and I'm telling you, he's not the king. And Samuel's like, well, I will not sit down until you bring him in. And onto the pages of history walks David. the most famous king of Israel. David, the son of Jesse, the son of Obed, the son of Boaz, the husband of Ruth, the Moabite, who was faithful in honoring her mother-in-law. And years go by. David is king. It's a powerful king. And another prophet, Nathan, speaks to David on behalf of God. And here's what he says to David. He says, "Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." And from this prophecy, Jewish people from that day forward recognized that one day God would bring another king, the Messiah, the Savior, the anointed one. And he would come from the family line of David, the son of Jesse, the son of Obed, the son of Boaz, the husband of Ruth, the Moabite. And so David had a son who had a son who had a son, and this went on for a while, for many generations. Many, many generations later, or to use the biblical word, many begats later. The biblical writer Matthew traces the line of David all the way down from David to Jesus, the King, the Messiah. And throughout his life, Jesus would be referred to as the Son of David. He was born in Bethlehem, the city of David, the home of Naomi, who would bring home a Moabite woman, who would marry Boaz, who would have a son, who would have a son, who would have a son, and that son would become a king, King David. And from David would come the ultimate king, Jesus. And when Jesus was born, we know wise men came from the east to worship him, but also to announce that not only had a baby been born, but a king had been born. A king had been born. And not only did they believe that that baby was a king, but the reigning king of the area, King Herod, also believed it. And he did everything he could figure out to stamp out his rival king. Many, many years later, Jesus would stand before Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, appointed by Tiberius, the Roman emperor. And Pilate would ask Jesus, point blank, "Are you a king?" He's trying to figure out what to do with Jesus. He looks at him point blank and says, "Are you a king?" And Jesus would turn and look at him right in the eye, stare down the power of Rome and say, "It is as you say, I am a king. For this reason I was born. But don't misunderstand, Pilate," he says. "My kingdom is not of this world. It's a kingdom that transcends this world. I've come to reign in the hearts of men and women, but yes, I am a king." And here's what's ironic. King Herod, who everybody knew in that day and age, and Pontius Pilate, who everybody knew in that day and age, over time would simply become footnotes in the story of King Jesus. Jesus, a king who would rule a different kind of kingdom. Jesus, the king who would leverage his power for the powerless. Jesus, the king who did what no other king ever imagined. Instead of requiring his followers to die for him, he would be the king that would turn it all upside down, the king that would lay down his life for his followers. The king whose throne would be established forever. The king whose kingdom is not of this world. And this is the story that God was working on in Boaz and Naomi and Ruth. This is a story that centered on Naomi, who thought, "God has abandoned me. God has forsaken me." This was the story from the very beginning. It's an incredible story, and it's a story that can include me and it can include you. You can become a part of the kingdom. You can become a part of the family if you yield the throne of your heart to the king. And as we end this series, I want to invite you to do something that you may have never done before. This is not something we do a lot at Brookview. but to simply say, God, instead of sitting on the throne of my own heart and my own life, doing whatever I want, when I want, with whomever I want, God, from now on, I want Jesus to be my king. I want to yield the throne of my heart to him, to invite him into my life, to reign and to rule and to lead me. And see, unlike every other king, Jesus doesn't force anybody to submit. He'll come in and he'll heal you and he'll forgive you and he will lead you, but he will not force his way in. He'll never force anything on you. And there's this really cool picture that I love in the New Testament of Jesus standing politely, knocking, just standing politely outside, knocking, waiting at the door, just knocking, waiting for you and for me to invite him in. And if you've never done that, I want to give you the opportunity today. Now, there may be that some of you have done that. You've done it before. You did it as a child or you did it a few years back, but you would say, you know what, to be honest, somewhere I stopped letting Jesus be my king. I've been doing what I want, when I want, with whom I want, and to tell you the truth, it's not working all that well. Okay, I know better, but I've wandered away. And if that's you, you might be wondering, would God really take me back? And the answer to that is absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you read the book of Judges, and time after time after time after time, the nation rebelled, and God never gave up. And time after time after time, God took them back, and he took them back, and he took them back, and he said, I'm going to work through you. I'm going to work through you. So whether it's the first time for you or whether this is more of like a return home, I just want to lead those of you that are interested in a little prayer. And I want to say from the outset, these are not magic words. It's not really even the words that matter or how they're spoken. It's your heart. The prayer is just an opportunity for you to express to your Heavenly Father that you are yielding the throne of your heart and your life to King Jesus. Your Redeemer, okay, your Savior, your King. So if you'd like, I just want to invite you to pray with me.